June 1943. A train moved slowly through the warm Texas night. German soldiers pressed their faces against the cold glass. Outside, endless lights glowed across the land. Farmhouses, roads, shop windows, all alive with power. For men who had lived in years of darkness, this brightness felt unreal. They had been told that America was weak, poor, and broken. But through the glass, they saw electricity flowing like water, factories shining at midnight, small towns brighter than Berlin. The power they saw outside made everything they had believed begin to tremble. The train stopped at a small station. American civilians stood waving. Children smiled. Inside the Pullman cars, there were padded seats, clean tables, warm food. These men had been told that America was falling apart. But what they saw was a nation overflowing with life. If you want more stories hidden behind the war, leave a like. It helps others find this history too. Because what these soldiers were about to see next, the machines, the cities, the power of a free people, would change their hearts forever. May 1943. The Desert War had ended. In Tunisia, thousands of German soldiers stood in long columns of dust and heat. Their uniforms were torn, their pride almost gone. They were the best of Rommel's Afrika Korps. Men who once believed the desert itself obeyed them. Now they waited quietly for the Americans, and for a future they could not imagine. The surrender felt unreal. For years, Nazi propaganda had promised victory after victory. But as they were loaded onto American trucks, the discipline that once ruled them turned into empty stares. Some whispered that capture by America was worse than death. Others looked around and saw organization, calm voices, and medical tents waiting for them. The war of guns was ending. The war of minds was beginning. In the port of Oran, Algeria, the prisoners entered a world of perfect order. Every name was recorded, every photograph taken, every paper stamped with care. Thousands moved through lines of doctors, clerks, and translators who spoke fluent German. It was not chaos. It was efficiency on a scale they had never seen. The Americans treated wounds, gave injections, and explained their rights calmly. No shouting, no fear, only routine. For men who believed the Reich was the model of order, this moment was a silent shock. They saw typewriters everywhere, machines stamping forms faster than a platoon could march. They saw officers who carried no whips, no anger, no hate. Even the food was organized, served on time, clean, enough for everyone. Many ate white bread for the first time in months. In that order and abundance, the first crack in their ideology appeared. That evening, the prisoners were fed. White bread, coffee, meat twice a day. At first, they refused to eat, believing it was a trick. But when the same meals returned the next day and the next, they realized this was normal. For the Americans, it was simply how soldiers ate. For the Germans, it was the first lesson in a new world. Men who had fought for glory now sat quietly over tin plates, tasting something they had not felt in years: security. In that moment, many understood why the Allies would win. The war was not just fought with tanks and planes, it was won by those who could feed their armies without fear of hunger. The battle for the mind of each prisoner had quietly begun. The Liberty ships waited in the harbor like iron cities on the sea. Thousands of prisoners were led aboard, one by one, their boots echoing on the metal decks. The Americans called each man by number, gave him a bunk, and handed out soap, clean towels, and food. For soldiers who had lived through the dust of Africa, the smell of soap alone felt like a miracle. When the engines started, the ship trembled, and the endless ocean opened before them. During the long crossing, many stood at the railings and watched the crew work. The Americans moved with calm skill, laughing as they repaired ropes or carried crates of food. Each day, the prisoners saw waste that shocked them. Half-eaten bread thrown away, gallons of milk poured out. What their armies had lacked for years, the Americans had in endless supply. It was not arrogance. It was simply normal life in a land of machines and energy. And slowly, the men began to realize Germany had already lost. August 1943. The prisoners saw land again. The Norfolk Naval Base stretched before them like a mechanical wonder. Cranes taller than church towers moved with electric precision. Dozens of ships unloaded supplies, while new ones were already leaving the docks. Smoke rose from factories, trains whistled in the distance, and the horizon shimmered with motion. For men taught that America was weak, this was like seeing the future. As they marched toward the waiting trains, they passed parking lots full of cars, hundreds of them owned by ordinary workers. In Germany, only the elite drove cars. Here, even laborers had their own. The guards offered water, smiled, and treated the prisoners with respect. No insults, no hatred. The enemy they had been told to despise behaved like hosts. One soldier whispered, "If this is how they treat us as captives, how powerful must they be in victory?" Their journey had only begun, and the next step would reveal the true scale of America's industrial miracle. When the German prisoners stepped onto the Liberty ship, they entered a floating world of metal and motion. The engines beat like a heart, steady and deep, as the ship prepared to cross the Atlantic. For men who had marched through the silence of deserts, this sound felt alive, mechanical yet powerful. The Americans moved with quiet skill, each sailor knowing his place. They did not shout. They did not boast. They worked as if the ocean itself obeyed them. As night fell, the deck glowed with soft light. The prisoners looked around, confused by the order and calm. Everything ran on electricity: kitchens, cranes, lights, even radios that played music through the dark. They had been told that America was primitive, without culture or unity. Yet here, on a single ship, they saw more power than an entire German port. The ocean wind carried the smell of food, diesel, and coffee. It was not just another world. It was another future. Every morning began with the smell of food. The cooks worked fast, laughing as they served eggs, bread, and coffee to hundreds of men. What shocked the prisoners most was not the food itself, but how much of it was thrown away. They watched sailors toss half-eaten meals into the ocean without care. To them, it meant nothing. To the Germans, it was unthinkable. In Africa, they had counted every crumb of bread. Here, waste was a symbol of abundance. Feld Kurt Zimmermann wrote later that the ship's crew wasted more food in one day than his entire company had eaten in a week. It was not cruelty. It was simply the way life worked in a land of endless production. The prisoners began to whisper among themselves. If this was how the enemy lived, how could such a nation ever lose? The ocean stretched endlessly around them. But for the first time, they no longer felt superior. They felt small. Deep below the deck, the prisoners heard the roar of engines. When guards allowed small groups to look, they saw machines unlike anything they had imagined. Huge pistons moving like living creatures, turning steel into motion. The air smelled of oil and heat. Sparks flashed from welding torches as engineers maintained the machinery without rest. The noise was deafening, but the rhythm was perfect. It was not chaos, it was creation. An officer explained that these ships were built in only a few days. The Germans laughed at first. Then they realized he was serious. 3 new ships every day. Thousands of engines built in factories spread across the country. Every part, every bolt came from another state. The scale was impossible. One man whispered that Germany had already lost not because of soldiers, but because of production. The ship was not only carrying prisoners, it carried the proof of a nation that could outbuild the world. Days passed slowly. The ocean stretched without end, blue and endless, like a moving mirror of sky. The prisoners began to talk more freely with their guards. Many of the Americans were young, not much older than them, friendly and curious. They asked about Germany, about the war, and sometimes about music. One sailor shared a cigarette with a prisoner from Hamburg. For a moment, there were no sides, just men drifting together across the sea. At night, the guards let them stand on deck. The wind smelled of salt and freedom. Some prisoners looked up at the stars and felt something strange, peace. They had been trained to see Americans as inferior, chaotic, and soft. Yet what they found were confident men who joked, worked hard, and treated them with dignity. Even in silence, that respect felt louder than speeches. It was a quiet education, one that no camp could teach. The ship finally reached the American coast. Fog lifted to reveal the skyline of New York. Tall buildings rising like silver towers above the harbor. Tugboats moved beside the Liberty ship, guiding it toward the docks. On the shore, cranes swung back and forth like giant arms of steel. The noise of the city felt alive. Trains, horns, voices, machines. For the prisoners, it was more than a place. It was proof that industry itself could be a weapon. As they disembarked, one German officer whispered that he now understood why America could fight on 2 fronts. Everything moved with purpose, with speed, with confidence. They had seen the strength of a free nation not in battlefields, but in its ports and factories. The air smelled of coal, metal, and victory. Ahead waited trains that would carry them deep into this strange new land. None of them could imagine that this journey would change their minds forever. When the prisoners stepped off the ship, the first thing they saw were trains waiting in perfect rows. But these were not the trains they knew, not freight cars for cattle or soldiers. These were passenger cars, clean, painted, fitted with seats and glass windows. An American sergeant apologized that the air conditioning was broken. To men who had crossed deserts and slept on sand, such comfort felt unreal. As the train began to move, it was as if the world outside changed shape. The sun rose over small towns glowing with light. Children waved from porches. Smoke rose gently from chimneys, and power lines followed the tracks like threads of silver. They had lived through blackout orders since 1940. Here, the night itself seemed alive. What they had been told was weakness. Now looked like civilization. The train rolled through endless miles of farmland, cities, and light. Every small town had glowing street lamps and shops open late into the night. The prisoners pressed their faces against the glass, whispering to each other that this could not be real. In Germany, even officers had lived in darkness and rationing, but here, every house had multiple lights on, even in empty rooms. At one station, they saw a railway crew loading coal with machines that worked by electricity. What took hours in Germany took minutes here. One engineer smoked while operating a crane that lifted more in a minute than a dozen men could in an hour. A young prisoner whispered, "This is not just wealth. This is power." And that word, power, began to echo quietly through every carriage. The journey had become a lesson in abundance. By the second day, the train crossed bridges, factories, and cities that never slept. From the windows, the prisoners saw cranes, power stations, and warehouses glowing like fireflies in the dark. In one town, a guard pointed to a large factory and said it produced aluminum for planes. The German prisoners were silent. In their country, a factory that size would have been destroyed long ago by bombers. Yet here, thousands worked freely under light and music. They passed endless rows of cars parked near the factories. Even laborers, they learned, owned their own automobiles. The prisoners had been promised Volkswagens, but only the party elite had received them. In America, it was the workers who lived like lords. The tracks glowed ahead like lines of fire, carrying them deeper into a country they had never imagined could exist. It was no longer a journey to a camp. It was a journey into disbelief. The trains rolled through Tennessee and Kentucky, cutting through valleys and rivers that glowed with industry. From their windows, the prisoners saw America's veins, railroads lined with power cables, bridges humming with electricity, and factories that never slept. The night sky was never dark. Sparks flashed from distant mills, cranes moved under floodlights, and locomotives passed in the opposite direction, filled with soldiers, coal, and supplies. Inside the carriages, men sat silently, unable to speak. Even those who still believed in the Reich felt something shifting. It was not only the size of the country that stunned them, but the rhythm of it. Every light they passed represented energy without fear. Every train that crossed theirs carried confidence instead of chaos. In that long, glowing journey, they began to understand that America's power came not from its weapons, but from its motion. They arrived in Texas after 3 days and nights. The air was warm, the sun heavy with gold, and the sound of cicadas filled the sky. Around them stretched vast land and quiet towns that still glowed after sunset. When they stepped down from the train, they realized that even in the smallest places, light never slept. They had crossed a continent of power. Now they would see how that power treated its enemies. If you find this story worth remembering, leave a comment below. Tell me what part of this journey surprised you most. These stories remind us how even the smallest moments, like a light shining through a train window, can change what a man believes. Because next, we enter the camps of Texas, where prisoners would discover that comfort, not cruelty, was the most powerful weapon of all. The train finally stopped near Hearne, Texas. The prisoners stepped out into the heat. Rows of wooden barracks stood in the distance, surrounded by fences and guard towers. But what they saw inside those fences made them stop in disbelief. There were electric lights, running water, hot showers, wooden floors. The camp looked more like a small town than a prison. As they walked through the gates, an American officer welcomed them politely and explained the rules in fluent German. They were not shouted at. They were not beaten. They were shown to their bunks and given blankets that smelled of soap. For men who had fought in deserts and slept on sand, it felt impossible. One soldier whispered that he had seen worse conditions in German barracks for their own troops. The first shock was not fear. It was comfort. The camp hospital was a revelation. Inside stood clean white beds, glass cabinets full of medicine, and doctors who spoke soft English mixed with German words. They treated wounds, infections, and exhaustion with care. One of the doctors explained how penicillin worked. The German medics listened in silence. In their own country, this drug was still a rumor. Here, it was used freely, even on prisoners. Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Bauer, a surgeon from the Africa Corps, later wrote that he could not believe what he saw. American nurses carried new surgical tools, clean bandages, and bottles of medicine that Germany had not seen since 1941. He realized that this camp was not a place of punishment. It was a classroom in civilization. Every operation, every clean sheet, every calm word spoke louder than propaganda. The war of weapons was over. The war of ideas had begun. Next came the kitchens. Large, bright buildings with refrigerators, mixers, and ovens that gleamed like machines from the future. German prisoners assigned to kitchen duty could not believe what they saw. Everything was electric. Meals for thousands were prepared without shouting, without chaos. There was fresh meat, milk, vegetables, and white bread. The menu changed every day. The cooks laughed as they worked, listening to radios that played soft music. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, once a chef in Munich, later wrote that he wept while throwing away untouched food. The rules required extra portions so that no man would go hungry. What was left was discarded. He said that this waste hurt more than defeat. It showed him a truth no propaganda could hide, that America had built not just power, but comfort. The prisoners were beginning to learn that kindness could be stronger than fear. By September 1943, many prisoners were sent to work on nearby farms and factories. At first, they expected hard labor and punishment. Instead, they were driven in trucks without blindfolds through open roads. They saw towns full of cars, shops, and people smiling. There were no ruins, no shortages, no signs of fear. The America they had imagined as weak and divided looked endless and strong. At the cotton gins and grain mills, they watched machines do the work of hundreds of men. Everything ran on electricity. One farmer explained that even the smallest communities had power lines. A German engineer whispered that his entire district in Berlin used less electricity in a day than this farm used in an hour. What amazed them even more was equality. American workers and farmers spoke freely with the guards and even with the prisoners. It was work, not war, that defined this nation's strength. Each day in the camps brought a new kind of lesson. The prisoners had seen the enemy's weapons, but now they saw the heart behind them. The guards shared newspapers, offered cigarettes, and even played soccer matches on Sundays. American families sent letters, food, and gifts for the men they had once called enemies. At Christmas, the camp choir sang in both German and English, and women from the local town baked cakes for them. For many, this kindness was the hardest thing to understand. If you believe these forgotten stories should be told, subscribe to the channel and help them reach more people. Because what these men experienced next, the realization that democracy could be stronger than dictatorship, would shape the future of two nations. Their time in America was no longer captivity. It was transformation. And as the days passed, every prisoner began to see that freedom itself could feed the world. The first time the prisoners were sent to American farms, they expected punishment. They imagined harsh orders, long hours, and empty meals. But what they found was silence and freedom. The trucks dropped them off under the open sky, surrounded by endless fields of wheat and corn. Farmers greeted them with simple nods and calm words. There were no armed guards shouting behind them, only the sound of wind and machinery. As they began to work, the difference became clear. The Americans worked alongside them, not above them. Men and women operated tractors, harvested grain, and joked with each other as if war did not exist. A single machine did the work of hundreds of men. When the sun went down, the fields glowed in gold and dust. One prisoner wrote that it was the first time since the war began that he had felt peace. The enemy's soil felt freer than his own. Each day revealed another kind of miracle. The prisoners watched as American farmers used machines they had never seen before: combines, electric pumps, trucks that carried water, and silos taller than church towers. Everything moved with precision. Nothing broke down. Even the smallest farms had electricity and running water. In Germany, these things were still dreams. A young engineer from Munich kept account of how many tools he saw in one day. He gave up after 1 hour. Their strength, he wrote, is not in soldiers, but in the hands of workers. The prisoners began to understand that democracy and efficiency could live together. There was order here, but it came from cooperation, not fear. They realized that freedom was not chaos. It was the power to build without permission. The prisoners were shocked most by how they were treated. Farmers offered them cold water, shared sandwiches, even let them rest in the shade. Sometimes they were invited into homes for lunch. Women brought the pies, children waved from fences, and nobody looked at them with hatred. These were the same people whose sons were fighting the Germans overseas, yet they showed compassion instead of anger. One prisoner later wrote that America's greatest weapon was its humanity. He said that no speech or banner could match the feeling of a farmer handing him a drink on a hot day. It was then that he understood why this country was so strong. Its people were not ruled by fear. They were guided by conscience. The lesson was quiet, but it would echo in every man who returned home. In Nebraska, the prisoners worked beside black and white Americans, all earning the same pay for the same work. It was something they had never seen. In the Reich, their teachers had said that such mixing led to weakness. but here it produced strength. The men joked together, traded cigarettes, and shared tools without hesitation. There was no shouting, no fear. For the first time, the prisoners witnessed a society that believed in fairness, not hierarchy. At night, they talked quietly about what they had seen. One man said that maybe this was why the Americans could build so much, so fast, because every hand was valued. Another whispered that freedom made people more loyal than fear ever could. The idea felt dangerous, but true. What the Reich had forbidden to imagine was unfolding before their eyes. Equality was not chaos. It was power shared among millions. By winter, the men no longer feared their labor assignments. Some volunteered to return to the fields each morning. They said it made them feel human again. Working beside free people, they had learned something no speech or book could teach. That dignity was not given by rank or uniform, but earned by effort. They had arrived as prisoners of war, but they were becoming witnesses of freedom. If you want to keep uncovering these forgotten human stories, leave a like and share this episode with someone who loves history. Because what comes next, the holidays inside the camps, the moments of laughter and music between enemies, shows that even in war, the human heart could find peace. The story of hearts and holidays is one you won't forget. As winter came, the camps changed. The air grew cold, and the guards began decorating the mess hall with paper stars and ribbons. The prisoners watched in silence, not understanding why. They were the enemy, yet the Americans were preparing a holiday for them. When the lights were turned on, the hall glowed in soft gold. It was Christmas in a land at war. Each prisoner received a small package: cigarettes, chocolate, soap, and postcards made by local children. A few men cried quietly. They had not seen such kindness since leaving home. American soldiers and prisoners sang together, their voices echoing through the wooden walls. For one night, the world forgot the war. Enemies shared songs instead of bullets. It was a peace more powerful than any treaty. The next morning, trucks arrived from nearby towns carrying boxes wrapped in paper. Churches, schools, and families had sent gifts to the prisoners. There were books, games, knitted scarves, and letters written in careful handwriting. Some messages began with the words, "To the man who once fought against my son." Yet every letter ended with kindness. "We wish you peace," they wrote. The prisoners were stunned. They had been told Americans were selfish and greedy. Instead, they found generosity even toward enemies. One soldier whispered that this was what real power looked like, the ability to forgive without fear. The guards smiled as they watched men who once carried rifles now holding gifts made by children. The war had taught them destruction. America was teaching them compassion. That evening, the camp choir prepared to sing. Half were Americans, half were German prisoners. Together they practiced carols in 2 languages. When the music began, even the guards at the towers stopped to listen. The sound rose into the night like a prayer carried by the wind. The men who had once aimed rifles at each other now sang about peace on earth. Feldwebel Hans Müller later wrote that it was the moment he stopped hating. He said that in those songs he heard forgiveness. The Americans sang not as victors, but as men who wanted the killing to end. For the prisoners, it was the first time they realized that mercy could feel stronger than power. The night ended with silence and tears. The war still raged far away, but in that camp, for a few hours, there was peace. Snow fell gently across the camp, covering the barbed wire and rooftops in white. The prisoners helped shovel paths, laughing as they worked beside the guards. Someone built a snowman wearing a soldier's helmet, and the guards joined in the joke. For a few days, war seemed far away. They played cards, shared coffee, and exchanged small gifts made from scrap wood and cloth. Letters arrived from families back in Germany, some full of sadness, some with hope. The Americans helped translate them. One guard found a letter for a man whose wife had given birth to a son he would never meet. The guard quietly gave the man his own photograph of his baby daughter and said, "Maybe they will grow up in peace." It was such simple humanity that changed the prisoners more than any lesson or speech could. When the holidays ended, life in the camp returned to its routine. Yet something inside the prisoners had changed. They worked, read, and studied with a new calmness. The guards noticed that the men smiled more often. At night, they sat by lamps, carving small wooden toys for the children who had written them letters. What had begun as captivity was becoming education. They had learned that kindness was not weakness. It was strength with purpose. If you enjoy discovering stories where humanity triumphs over hate, comment below and tell me what moment in this story touched you most. Because what comes next, the inner transformation of minds once devoted to tyranny, will reveal how compassion defeated ideology. In Chapter 7, The Collapse Within, the true victory will not happen on the battlefield, but inside the human soul. By 1944, something had begun to change inside the minds of many prisoners. They still wore uniforms with German insignia, but their voices grew quieter. The camp libraries were full of books, American newspapers, history, and even philosophy. Men who once marched proudly under the swastika now sat in silence, reading about democracy and freedom. Some joined small study circles, writing questions that they had never been allowed to ask. The guards called it education, but for the prisoners, it was something deeper. They began to realize that the world outside Nazi Germany had not collapsed as they were told. It had thrived. One man wrote that reading American newspapers felt like walking into sunlight after years in a tunnel. The certainty of propaganda was fading. They still missed home, but now they feared returning to what they had once defended. In every camp, there were men who still called themselves loyal Nazis. They wore their medals proudly, spoke of Hitler, and mocked those who doubted. But their voices grew fewer each week. Others had stopped listening. They saw the contradiction. Their leaders preached superiority. Yet it was the Americans who had fed them, healed them, and treated them as equals. Ideology could not survive in the light of daily kindness. A secret report written by American officers called this the Quiet Revolt. It was not rebellion with weapons, but with thought. Prisoners who once repeated slogans now spoke of rebuilding, of learning, of change. The loudest fanatics began to look small, like echoes of a world already gone. Each friendly conversation, each shared meal was a quiet step away from the darkness they had carried. Soon, American officers began inviting educated prisoners to teach classes. They studied English, science, and even economics. Universities sent books and professors volunteered to visit. For many prisoners, it was the first time they had ever been asked to think, not just obey. They learned how laws worked, how free press functioned, and why people could disagree without fear. One day, a professor said, "Freedom is not chaos. It is the courage to trust others." The room fell silent. The words stayed with them. A soldier from Hamburg later wrote that those lessons broke something inside him, not his pride, but his blindness. He finally understood that true strength was not control, but cooperation. The men who once believed in conquest were discovering the power of understanding. By early 1945, the prisoners began to speak openly about what they had seen and learned. For months, they had carried doubts quietly, afraid of being called traitors. Now, the silence broke. They gathered in small groups at night, sharing stories about their families, about what they would change when they returned home. Some spoke of guilt. Others spoke of hope. The guards noticed the change. The camps that once echoed with arguments now hummed with conversation. A few loyal Nazis tried to regain control, but their words felt hollow. The prisoners had outgrown them. The new war was not against armies or nations, it was against ignorance. What the Americans had given them was invisible, yet unstoppable. The courage to think for themselves. When news of Germany's collapse reached the camps, many men cried. They were no longer proud soldiers. They were witnesses of an idea that had failed. Yet, instead of anger, there was calm. They buried the flags they once worshipped, not out of shame, but out of understanding. One officer said quietly, "Maybe losing was the only way to win ourselves back." If you believe history is not just about battles, but about people finding their humanity again, subscribe and share this story with others. Because what came next, their return to a broken homeland, would test everything they had learned in captivity. In Chapter 8, The Long Road Home, the war will finally end, but the journey toward forgiveness will only begin. Even after the war ended, the prisoners did not return home immediately. Many camps stayed open for months, some for years. The men worked repairing roads, helping rebuild towns, and harvesting crops. For them, peace felt slow and uncertain. They dreamed of families they had not seen in years, and countries that might no longer exist. The barbed wire still stood, but the guards now greeted them as friends. In those long days, time became their teacher. They learned patience, humility, and the quiet art of forgiveness. Some prisoners began writing diaries about what they had seen in America, its power, its fairness, its humanity. They promised that when they returned home, they would tell the truth. They would not forget the light they had found behind the fences. The waiting was not punishment anymore. It was preparation for a new beginning. When mail service finally resumed, the prisoners began sending letters home. They wrote about kindness, work, and light. They described the cities that never went dark, the people who treated enemies like neighbors, and the strange feeling of being free while still behind fences. The letters shocked families back in Germany. They could not believe such things were true. Some of the letters were censored. Others were shared in secret. Many told their wives and children not to fear the future. "We have learned," one man wrote, "that strength comes from mercy." In towns shattered by war, these words became small sparks of hope. Through letters, the truth crossed the ocean long before the men did. It was the beginning of reconciliation, written by those who had once been the enemy. In 1946, trains began carrying the first groups of prisoners to ports along the Gulf Coast. The Americans shook their hands, wished them luck, and thanked them for their work. Some prisoners cried as they boarded, leaving behind men who had become their friends. They looked out from the train windows at the land that had changed them forever. As the trains moved south, the prisoners passed through the same small towns they had once entered in fear. This time, children waved from porches and women smiled. No one shouted. No one cursed. The same America that had captured them was now sending them home with dignity. One man said quietly, "They conquered us with kindness." It was a victory no army could plan. When the ships reached Europe, the men stood silently on the deck. The ports of France and Germany looked nothing like the land they had left years ago. Cities were reduced to ashes, bridges broken, factories empty. The war that had once filled them with pride had left their world in ruins. Some searched the horizon for familiar shapes, but the landscape itself felt foreign. As they stepped onto the docks, Allied officers greeted them without cruelty. Many were given food, coffee, and train tickets to reach their homes. Along the way, they saw children begging for bread, churches without roofs, and villages where the only color came from wildflowers growing in rubble. They realized that the war had not been lost in battle. It had been lost in hearts. Freedom had survived, but only on the other side of the ocean. In the years that followed, many of the former prisoners became teachers, engineers, and writers. Some helped rebuild Germany's schools. Others spoke in public about what they had seen in America. They said that the greatest power was not found in weapons or walls, but in freedom, knowledge, and kindness. Their voices began to change how a nation thought about itself. If you believe that history should remember not only how wars are fought, but how hearts are healed, leave a like and share this story with others, because the story does not end here. In the last chapter, we will return to the quiet lessons of this journey and reflect on how compassion, once planted in a prisoner's mind, can grow strong enough to rebuild the world. Years later, many of the former prisoners looked back on their time in America as the moment their lives had truly begun. They had entered the camps as soldiers, full of pride and fear. They left as men who had seen another way to live. The memories of fields, music, and light followed them home. Some called it the second birth. They built families, homes, and quiet lives. Some wrote books, others painted or taught children. All carried one truth with them, that kindness, once seen, could never be forgotten. It echoed through their words, their work, and their silence. The war had tried to teach them hate. America had shown them compassion. And that compassion, in the end, was what stayed. Decades after the war, historians found thousands of letters written by German prisoners from American camps. They spoke of fairness, of freedom, of the strange beauty of being treated as human by one's enemy. Many of these letters had been hidden, unread for years. When finally published, they surprised a new generation. In classrooms and museums, young students read those words and realized that victory was not only military, it was moral. The letters became bridges between past and present. One historian wrote, "These men were defeated in battle, but they were rescued in spirit." Their words had traveled through time like light that refuses to fade. The story of these camps is not just about captivity. It is about what people choose to do with power. The Americans could have answered cruelty with cruelty. Instead, they built a world inside fences that reflected their highest ideals. Through books, meals, and music, they fought a quieter war, the war for the mind. For the men who lived through it, the lesson was clear. Light does not need to shout to be seen. It shines through small acts, the warmth of a meal, the sound of a song, the patience of a teacher. History often remembers weapons, but true victory lies in the hands that offer peace when hate is easier. If you believe that history is more than battles, that it's about people, choices, and the quiet power of compassion, subscribe to the channel and share this story with someone who needs hope tonight. Because these men's journey reminds us that even in darkness, light can be taught, passed on, and remembered. The story of the German prisoners in America is not only about defeat, it's about rediscovery. In a world broken by war, they found a truth that outlived nations, that humanity itself can be stronger than hate. The light they found across the ocean never went out.